Speech to Print. This is Chapter 3, Phonology, Speech Sounds in Use. So we're going to go back and we're going to look at the role of phonological skills in that progression of reading development. We're also going to take a look at spoken syllables and how they are helping to build that phonological proficiency and some key features in which we need to teach students those spoken syllables. Also, we're going to be looking at something called allophonic variations, which occur in co-articulation because we do not speak our sounds in isolation. And so when we put our sounds together, some oddity things happen that's common among different dialects. And we also are going to take a look at some student writing, and we're going to be able to practice finding some errors and looking for some phonological errors within the writing. This gives us a little window into how they're processing through these skills, if they're connecting skills, and if they are being successful in establishing this phonological awareness and the ability to manipulate those phonemes. So let's dive into the brain again, returning back to that idea of where those neurological pathways are occurring and how they're connecting. As we've gone through the first couple chapters, and as you've practiced this in your classrooms, think about any aha moments that you might have noticed. Have you seen any evidence in these practices that we've been putting in place and in these lessons, these chapters? Have you been able to see that in your students? Take a minute and reflect on that. All right. So first of all, let's start with what is the phonological system? Well, this is the study of speech sounds in any given language, including the rules and patterns by which these phonemes are combined into words and phrases. That's the phonological system. So that's going to include individual sounds, it's going to include words, it's going to include syllables. So there's rules and patterns that govern the way that we speak and the way that we allow sounds to come together. Knowing this is incredibly important, especially as we start to attach a letter representation to that, because knowing that certain sounds can't be next to each other also kind of helps us know that their letter representation can't be next to each other, or that there will be a different sound represented by that combination in some circumstances. So some constraints that we might see, some phonotactic constraints. Remember, these are how words come out of our mouth and how we speak and form them. This isn't spelling constraints. These are all focused on what sounds we're allowed to put in what sequence. So, moving on, sorry about that. Looking at the first one, let's take a look at DAKS as opposed to DKSA. Now, we are allowed to pronounce things in this sequencing because our mouth will flow from sound to sound, but we have a hard time producing this sequence of sounds because our mouth does not like to move between these areas of articulation as smoothly. So what this represents is there are certain sequencing of sounds that our mouth will permit and others that we don't like, we don't want to do. So there will be certain sounds that will flow and certain sounds that will not flow together. Next one is we will allow certain blends to be at the beginning, or certain sounds to be at the beginning, such as is the only possible sequencing for these two examples because we don't like the sound at the beginning of an English word. That will be permitted in other languages, but not in English. We also only allow certain blends. So where we only allow certain sounds at the beginning, we only allow certain blends to come together. Like we would have STR for stir, but we won't allow still. So in English, that's another constraint. We also will want to have vowels following liquids and glides or nasals and affricates. We don't want to have a consonant following a liquid or a glide or a affricate or a nasal. And so that's a good thing to recognize. If we have that as our beginning sound, we know a vowel sound is going to come next. Also, at the end, we only allow certain nasals to be followed by certain consonants. Like we would have MP for mp, but we won't have mk. Now we can have nk, which is an N sound, so that is permitted, but there are only certain nasals that come with other consonants following it, and nasals will come after a vowel. That's why vowels get messed up. Okay. Here's another example of having a glide that is going to be followed by a vowel and not have it being followed by any other kind of consonant. And then we won't have a consonant in front of a nasal. We will always have a vowel in front of a nasal. We also have certain syllable rules, open and closed syllables. If it is a closed syllable, it will produce a short vowel. We will not have an open syllable creating a short vowel sound. And the last one is there are certain vowel combinations that we're going to put together, as in this is not going to be cout, it's going to be something else. There's certain spellings we won't allow in certain positions, and this will be cat. Of course, that'll be an allowed spelling to go for an allowed sound that we have with certain vowel combination sounds. So it gives you an idea that this phonological skill, being able to know what sounds are allowed in progression, is really going to help students understand what spelling patterns to be used, how to pronounce things, because they realize that certain things can't occur in certain areas. So why do we care about this? Well, because we need to fast map those sounds to letters, and the more we know about those phonological rules, the easier we're going to be able to connect them to a letter representation and build up automaticity. That will allow us to then be able to code and recognize our words. And that recognition is actually more dependent on our ability to break the sounds up than it is to blend them together, because we do hear and see it. We see every single letter and we hear every single sound. We just then have to blend it together, but we do segment. You have clear images of that sound and letter connection created when you have a strong phonological base. And then it bolsters your vocabulary memory and your language comprehension as well, because you're adding meaning to that. So how do we get there? Well, with explicit instruction and practice with exact phonological and phoneme skills. That can make all the difference, such a critical difference in a child's progress. So looking at those statements, I know I did not read them exactly the way they're written, but look at those statements and which one stands out the most to you? Which one is kind of a big game changer for maybe a way that you used to view things? Okay. So there are some recommendations for teaching phonological awareness and putting that into your phonics lesson. You need to have a development plan, so follow the progression of phonological awareness from basic phonological awareness to more advanced phonological awareness. Focus your attention on speech sounds and encourage articulation awareness, that they're able to feel it and articulate it correctly, know where to put the tongue, the placement, and the lip shape. Include all of the English phonemes. Don't skip any. Don't even skip X and Q, because they are unique, but they're unique graphic representations of sound combinations. So we approach it a little different, but we don't skip any of our English phonemes. And use multisensory whenever possible. Have them draw it in sand, have them get up and move, have them hear and manipulate with some visual blocks, so that you can have a multisensory input in there. They don't have to be very long activities. They can be brief, 5 to 10 minutes, usually at the most. And of course, you're going to begin by doing an I do, we do, you do, because you're going to build and scaffold into that independence. Give them correct feedback if they give the letter name, because remember, we're focusing on the sound, and they need to make sure that they can articulate and comment and respond to the sound. Instead of having dependence on the letter, a lot of errors will come up if they're too dependent on the letter name. And then, we're going to use the letter name and the graphemes to represent the sounds after the students are very firm on the sound, identifying the sound, locating the sound, and creating the sound. So once you get those basics, move on to the advanced phonemes. So here's some examples of some basic phonological awareness activities, things like rhyme matching, syllable deletion, syllable blending, onset rhyme division. And then you get to more advanced phonological awareness, things like sound blending, initial final sound substitution, sound chaining, syllable tracking, and then of course eventually translating to the letter sound correlation. So looking now at syllables, remember we're talking about oral syllables, not the written syllable division that you see in the dictionary, because we begin with what we hear. I would introduce this idea of syllables using any one of the fun little ways that talk about the syllable as a beat, as a word part. It is kind of segmented in how we say things, so you can talk about how it sounds like a little bit of rhythm or a little bit of a beat sound to that. These are a couple that I have discovered that are kind of fun. The one from Scratch Garden and Silly Bulls are very kid friendly. This video down here at the bottom goes into more detail about syllable patterns and syllable division. It's produced by the Reading League. Really informative, very helpful, but very much geared toward an adult. So we're gonna watch just a little bit of the Scratch Garden and just a little bit of the Silly Bulls so you can see how one way you can approach syllables to young children.
First part is le.
Oop, let's start from the beginning. Sorry about that. You can tell I've watched this video before.
Hi! Okay, everybody. The English language has many words. Like this. Huh! So many words. And every word can be split into parts. We call these parts syllables. A word could have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or even more syllables.
Could a word have 1,000,000 syllables?
No, that is too many syllables.
What about 4 syllables?
Yes, I already said that. Ha! No more questions. Anyway, a syllable is like a beat. Do you know what a beat is? Drummer! Please play a beat. Thank you. That is a good beat. You can make a beat by clapping your hands. Now get those hands up. Let's practice one beat. Okay, ready? Here we go. Clap. Ha ha! Now let's try it with some words. We start with the easy ones. Words with 1 syllable and therefore 1 beat. The first word is dog. Dog. I said dog. Ha ha! Good girl. Now everybody clap your hands to make 1 beat when I say the word.
Now the fun thing about some of these is, yes, you're going to start with this idea of beat, but he does go further on in explaining something you need to make sure to explain are some key features of syllables. So we're going to look at some of that now. Some key features is that a syllable is a unit of speech and it is organized around a vowel. So when you're looking for where to find your beats, be looking for your vowel sounds. Make sure to look for the vowel sounds and not the vowel letters. So therefore, it's important to know that the number of vowel sounds that you have in a word are going to be the same as the number of syllables that a word will have. The vowel is then the peak of the syllable, or the high point, the main focus. And we can have any number of consonants on either side of the vowel, up to even 3 on one side and 3 on the other side, as in scrimped. It still contains just 1 vowel sound. You would have just 1 vowel standing alone, like in A. But all of these are showing 1 vowel sound with a different combination of consonants on either side, because the vowel is the peak. Now, students who swap positions of that vowel with the liquids or the nasals, that's an indication of an underdeveloped idea or underdevelopedness of phonological awareness, and needs some more practice about sequencing, hearing those sounds. Now, anything in front of the vowel sound is going to be called the onset, and there's a value and be able to break that off, because rhyming occurs when you are dealing with the vowel and the rest of the word. So the actual rhyme of the word is the vowel and everything after. So if we're talking about a student's ability to rhyme words together, they really have to have the ability of breaking a word into the onset and the rhyme, and then holding on to the rhyme and be able to attach a new onset to it to find a word that is a rhyming word, right? Now, not every word has to have an onset, but every word must have a rhyme because the rhyme contains the vowel, and every word must have a vowel sound. Now, a common mistake that you will get in programs is that they will refer to consonants and vowels as letters and not sounds, and so then there could be some confusion, especially when you have consonants that are being used to create vowel sounds. So always remember to come through the sound, and then you're going to be using the letters as a spelling of that sound. Okay. Also, sometimes consonant clusters, when you get multiple consonants in a row, those can be difficult to segment, and it's going to take a lot of extra practice. Something that we're going to talk a lot more about in further units, chapter 7, in chapter 4, is something called the maximal onset rule. And this occurs when you listen to how a word is spoken and how the syllable is spoken, as opposed to how it is broken into syllables through written expression or through the dictionary. And it's not always going to be the same. So just be aware that when you are trying to work with syllables, that you can say the syllable to find the number of syllables, but don't use that to identify where the syllable break is, because it won't be the same. We'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 4. Okay, so let's practice that idea though here in the next slide. Let's look at that maximal onset rule. Yes, we'll talk more about it chapter 4 as well, but let's practice a little bit now to give you a little bit of preview for that. Basically, what that phenomenon occurs is we want to transfer a consonant sound over into the second syllable when we are in a two-syllable word. So for example, if you save this first word, lifting, then you have a break between the F and the T, and that's usually how we say it, right? Lifting. If we were in a dictionary though, we would not be splitting the word between the F and the T. We would be taking off the ing. So it'd be lift, syllable break, ing. So this is that maximal onset phenomenon. We are going to be, for ease of speaking, carrying over a consonant to the next syllable and leaving our vowels kind of open in some words and kind of not. For example, in chatter, we'll say chatter, leaving our vowel open but still saying it as a short vowel, because in a true syllable break, it's a closed syllable with the two T's. Ant hill, of course, works because that one is compound word. Say planet, we say planet. So you can see where this would cause a lot of confusion if we were working with students about where to find the syllable, and it's not correct with our syllabication rules, and it's not correct with our pronunciation rules. It's just a weird thing that our mouth does for ease of speaking. And what we use this saying the syllable is mostly just to find the number of syllables. So try a few more. Wagon, lemon, salad. You see it occurs quite a bit. Bankrupt, hammer, level, blast off, suppose. So that would cause a lot of havoc on a student if we were trying to divide the syllable or be able to code the syllable based on what our mouth does there. Now, later on in chapter 4, we'll talk more about the syllabication rules and why we have them and why we use them, but keep that in mind not to confuse the two when you're talking about oral syllables with a student. Now, like I said, we can say the syllable to hear it, to see how many we have, and that's the primarily function of speaking out the syllable. So we're going to practice that right now. How many spoken syllables do you hear? Woe be gone. You should have counted 3 because we have 3 vowel sounds. O, E, ah. Let's try the next one. Watermelon. Look at your vowel sounds. Ah, ah. There should be 4 syllables then. blabbermouth. Blabbermouth. 3 vowel sounds, 3 syllables. Piggyback. 3 vowel sounds, 3 syllables. Here's a longer one. Electrocardiograph. Let's count our vowel sounds. E, O, R, E, O, A. How many did you count? You should have counted 7 vowel sounds, so therefore there are 7 syllables. Oversimplify. O, I. There should be 5. Oversimplify. So you have O, I. All right, now a lot of times this will help with intonation, and it'll help with where the stress is and where the non-stress is, because like as we will talk later on further again about schwa and those unstressed words, sometimes the pronunciation will also change depending on how you're adding things to the word, which we'll talk about in chapter 5. So just be aware of that some of that stress will shift and some of the pronunciation will shift. So where we add that stress, so their intonation can change the pronunciation of words. So here we have elementary, so you have elementary or elementary. A little bit different in pronunciation when you're changing the stress. Archipelago, archipelago, buffet. This one I think is the most obvious. Mischievous or mischievous, a little bit different pronunciation. Employee, Armageddon. This one I can't quite find, but it was one of the examples. See if you can figure it out and then let me know. Epitome and complementary or complementary. A little bit different. So those stresses, they can be shifted, which also shifts a little bit of the meaning sometimes. For example, if you have history and then historian, we're going to emphasize this a little bit, and we get a little bit of different pronunciation on some other words that are coming up. Civilized, civilian, a little bit different. The stress is somewhere a little bit different. Changes the pronunciation a little bit. Sometimes you get a little bit more of a schwa in there. Illustrate, illustrious. Now those ones are a little harder to see. You just feel the emphasis move a little bit. These ones are very much changing the meaning as well as some of the pronunciations, because you have content and content. You have produce and produce, or record and record. Totally different meanings because we've shifted the stress of the word and slight pronunciation. So help those kids in those older grades to see and recognize that. Now, again, if a student or an individual is pronouncing those incorrectly, even after you've shown them and given them feedback, that's showing a phonological weakness, and they'll need to have some extra emphasis and practice on that. Okay? Here are a couple of examples of some that happen a lot with adults, and I'm guilty of the synonym and synonym one. All right, let's switch off to allophonic variations. An allophonic variation is what happens when you have co-articulation and certain sounds are following each other. And there are about 7 that are common that you'll see showing up more. Now, sometimes you will also have some dialect allophonic variations that show up, but they're not as common, so they're not generally wide accepted as consistent. Let's start with vowel lengthening. Now, vowel lengthening occurs, it's something we hear, but is not necessarily something that is true, I guess is how you say it, but it feels like this occurs because when you have a voiced consonant after a vowel, it makes it feel like you are saying the vowel a little longer because you're keeping your voice on as you move into that next sound, as opposed to when the consonant after the vowel is unvoiced and you're turning your voice box off, it feels like you're shortening or not saying the vowel quite as long. So here's a couple examples. say the first one. This is a voiced Z and an unvoiced S. Sees and cease. Listen carefully to the length of time it seems that we take to make that E sound. Sees, cease. This one should feel just slightly longer. It's most apparent in short vowels. Bed, bet, bed, bet. And I am saying them the same speed, but it almost feels like this E is held on to a little bit longer. Keel, keep, keel, keep. Heed, heat. Part of that's because you are turning your voice off, so you are feel like you're cutting that vowel short a little bit. Now, why this matters is because we have a really bad habit of using the term long and short when we're talking to our vowels. This was something that was attached to words that we were speaking in Middle English when the vowels and the spelling were determined by how they were spoken, but we don't do that anymore. And so the labels have very little meaning as they do now. We don't say a long vowel longer or a short vowel shorter. It really can be long and short on both of them because, as you can see with this vowel lengthening, it feels like we're saying this short vowel a little longer. So it can be confusing to kids when you're saying, hey, long and short is a length of duration of how we're speaking. And they have no connection to that. Long vowels are tense and tight vowels. Your mouth is very tight when you're making them. Short vowels are relaxed vowels. Your mouth is very relaxed. So if we can turn back into those labels instead of long and short, it'll help eliminate some of that confusion for kids. Okay, often vowels will be produced as a neutral schwa in an unaccented syllable, getting that short or I sound. This is when you're having no stress on a syllable. Remember, a good way to find that is to call the dog. You're going to pretend that the word is the name of your dog, and you're going to pretend you're standing at the doorstep and you're calling your dog in, come inside, and like, here, Rover. And you're going to do that with the word. And when your voice is high and longer, that is the stressed part of the word. When it drops in tone and it's shorter, then that is where the schwa occurs. So let's practice with this one. Imitate, imitate. This one, is a lot shorter than the im and the tate. And so you have a slight schwa there, imitate. Then you have blossom, 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 calling your dog in for dinner. So your occurs right here on the second syllable. Now, just as kind of a general rule of thumb, the schwa is going to occur most often in the second syllable for multisyllabic words, but it can occur in the middle in a 3-syllable word. So you're going to find often that sometimes it's helpful for kids just to know that hey, most of our words in English are going to be unaccented on the second syllable, which happens to be the middle syllable in a 3-syllable word. Occasionally we have a first syllable that's unaccented, like again and to go, but those are very specific circumstances, and they usually spelled with an A at that point, so it's sometimes helpful to know that as well. Like about. Then you have application, narrative, this is where a slight I sound comes in, and argumentative. So you have an A and an I. They both count as schwa because they are both unaccented. Orthographic, orthographic, and competition, competition. Now I said it like that on purpose so you could hear the I and the Sometimes a little harder for us to hear that schwa as a slight I. Now, when we speak, we apply these stresses automatically because that's the language in which we were raised in most of the time. And so we apply it in nonsense words as well. Students from other languages are going, or other language learners are going to struggle with this. So they'll need some extra practice in knowing what the typical trend is when we speak schwa. Okay, let's talk about voice nasalization or vowel nasalization. This is what happens when you have a vowel followed by a nasal, which will occur very often. You don't have consonants before nasals. So whenever a nasal appears, you know that the vowel is going to be affected. And what happens is as you're making the vowel sound, regardless of where the vowel originates from, you're nasalization is going to pull the sound to the back of your mouth and up into your nasal cavity, which then raises your tongue and raises and pulls back the vowel sound that you're in the process of making, which can often pull it into a tighter vowel or a slightly whiny version of the vowel sound that you're making. You see that in words like and add, and you could feel like it gets a little whiny there. Add is just very much forward where it as should be. How about limb and lib? Limb, almost like an I coming up there. That I gets higher. Limb, lib. Here's another example. Monk, buck, monk. Kind of goes almost back into that sound there. Very hard for students to pull out these because they are so overpowered by that nasal. Went, wet, went, wet. It's slightly whiny. The one that you feel the most on is I when it's followed by an N. Gets very, very, very whiny, and A's get very, very whiny. And so they often sound like an A instead of an A. Like in gang, it's like ang. It's actually an A, but it pulls it so hard and so far back so hard that it feels like an A instead of an A. And things like ing do the same thing. Ank is another one. Anytime you pull back to that sound, it's pulling it even further. The last one is don't and dote. Now, children will frequently kick out that consonant because it's so much moving the vowel that they feel it's part of the vowel, and that vowel moves so much it almost feels like it becomes a different vowel. So don't be surprised if an underdeveloped phonological awareness is omitting that nasal in their spelling or in their reading. Just remember that those vowels are often influenced by that nasal. All right, so the next one is a consonant aspiration. This is a strange occurrence that happens when we have a voiceless stop occurring at the beginning of a stressed syllable, and there's a little puff of air that comes along with the sound when you're making it. So if you say something like candy canes, you have a voiceless stop, this k sound, and as you move on to the rest of the syllable or the vowel sound, you start to feel this little puff of air as your voice turns on. Candy canes. It's like we're pushing a little bit extra air before we turn our voice box on. And they often represent that with an H. So if you see students that are adding H's after a stop, this is why. They're feeling that just before I turn the voice box off, I'm going to push out a little bit more air. So you can see that in things like place, appalled, clean, accountable, tame, and attended. You can feel that little puff of air come out. But then you don't feel it in things like spend, soap, scare, sock, because you're kind of ending there. A lot of times when they're at the end of words, they don't have that little aspiration. And even with certain vowels, they won't have a certain aspiration. It's very interesting. Now this also can show sometimes why they switch out their voiceless stop to their voiced partner, because you are about to turn your voice on, and so they're like, oh, well, I'm just gonna have my voiced partner, because you're made in the same way. And it's interesting because more often when they are not aspirated that they do this. You might have an SB because you've got your voice going on in a different way. It's interesting. All right. Now this was a very funny aspiration, or an aspiration, allophonic variation, because with this one, this is how we sound American and how the British sound British a lot of the time. I've heard it in many British interviews that if they want them to get an American accent, first they make their vowels a lot more wide and less tall and less resonating in the middle of their mouth. Americans speak very much in the front of their mouth and very wide. But another way that they sound American is by doing this flapping medial. And basically what a flapping medial is that all of your T sounds in the middle of your word are going to flip to a D sound. And the reason why that occurs is because you have your voice on for the vowel and you have the voice on for the vowel after, and we're just too lazy to turn our voice off. But the British usually are not as lazy as we are, and they'll turn it off. So where we will say pudding, and change this to a d sound, keeping our voice on, pudding, and of course the D is articulated in the same place as the T. The British will turn their voice off and make it putting. So you can sound very British without even trying by just making that its voiceless sound. Putting, little, writer, instead of rider, little, pudding, as what Americans tend to do. Yeah. This does not occur though if there is a consonant before the T or the D. So you have panda, rooster. So we've already changed into something different when we're doing consonant to one of those. It only occurs when there's vowels around it, which is kind of funny. Now, remember we were talking about that nasal, pulling the tongue up and pulling it back to a higher vowel? Well, this also can occur with a K and a G sound as well, the K and the G. And what's happening again is that you are moving your articulation from a lower position. Here you have it in the front of your mouth, kind of in the middle, and you're going to be pulling your tongue all the way toward the back, where the bulk of your tongue's in the back, to make that G sound. So it sounds a little bit more of an EA sound as you go up. So here we have a low A, and as you're pulling your tongue back to say the G sound, you're actually getting closer to this A as that movement, just that anticipation of going into that next consonant sound. That's why we have to be very careful on sound spelling cards that we don't have any of these kind of sounds or even the L sound in our picture after our vowel sound to represent the short vowel, because it gets too confusing. If you think bat, b-at, very much of an A. But I say bag, bag, it's an I. It just, you feel it pulling. And it's not a very clear representation of that short vowel. Here's another one, etch, egg. It sounds like an A almost, because you're pulling from an E back up, and you're going to pass up through that A sound again. Icky, igloo, it almost sounds like an E. Igloo. That's what happens with ing all the time, and why people are confused with ing. Ing starts with an E. It just gets pulled in up so quickly that it sounds a lot like an E sound, right? Okay, now a consonant stop happens with a blend. So if a consonant stop is followed by an R, then you're passing right through some of these affricates, right? So it sounds then as a ch or a j. If you listen closely, you still hear it starting as a t and ending with an and you can see the difference when you use a minimal pair of that occurrence happening, this affrication, as opposed to a true affricate. So let's take a look for a second. We have take, which is just a t to an A. We add an in there, and when the train, you hear a slight ch come in, because you're passing from your t sound through the ch down to the sound. So it makes sense that as your mouth is anticipating that move, it's moving into that position, but you just haven't, you're starting to turn your voice on. And again, it's that co-articulation, slurring, blending together makes it sound like a ch. So then you have the same thing happening from a DR to becoming a j. Desk, dress, you hear a little bit of a j in there. Addict, educate, you have it again sometimes with when you're moving to an U, because again with the U, your mouth is doing that same position that the R is. Educate, you get a little bit of a j in there. So anticipation of glides or liquids is going to cause that mouth to pucker a little bit more, tricking the speaker into putting into almost like an affricate right away. Minimal pairs are going to be huge for this, because that's going to allow students to feel and hear the difference between this affrication and a true representation of the affricate. So if I say chip, as I eat a chip for lunch, there's a big difference in how that feels as to trip. I'm going to take a trip to the store. So if I say trip, chip, trip, chip. You can feel your mouth different and move, and you can start emphasizing that so they don't make that mistake anymore. All right, so let's take a look at some spelling and let's analyze that and see if we can find any correlations or any indications that the student is struggling in phonological readiness or where their holes might be. So, first up, the target word was day, came, and fell, and this is how the student spelled it. So what's happening is we have the long vowel sound is being spelled with the letter name, so that they're hearing every single sound. Therefore, they don't really have a phonological error at this point. They have more of a graphotactical error, which just means they have the wrong representation for that sound. Let's take a look at the next group. Bad, fish, cut, got, sugar. Well, bad, as being spelled with an eh. Fish is missing that sh sound. Kit and cut has that vowel sound, right? And got has a totally wrong sound. It and ah are close, but not quite the same one. And then sugar is shag. So the H sound is being confused with the R sound because their articulation's pretty sloppy. The short vowels are being spelled the letter name closest to it in articulation. So they have an unsophisticated or an underdeveloped sense of hearing that sound and creating that sound, because when they're reproducing it, they're getting close, but they're not quite getting the same articulation that they should. So they're going to need to be retaught how to feel those sounds, how to hear them and to feel it, so they get closer to the more precise pronunciation, which then will they be able to attach to the right letter. Looking at the next row, we have jump and an end, and if you notice, all of those nasals have been omitted before their consonants and after their vowels. So they need to go back and re-segment. They need to develop that segmentation a little bit and hearing the difference between the vowel sound and the movement into the nasal, because right now they're feeling that as one big movement, and they need to realize that those are two different sounds, because when you move like that much, that's going to be a different sound. Looking at little, bigger, open, if you notice they have little, bigger, open. Their R, L, N are having such a strong dominance that they are, of course, doing the medial flip here. So you can talk to them about that. But then letting them break up apart and talking about, hey, you know, big-er is different than bigger. The R has been mistaught here. It's r and not Open, we're missing the E. So we have to pull back a little bit from that strong dominance and help them break that apart. If you look at the next one, you have your inflected endings are being spelled phonetically. So this is more of a morphological issue. They're still hearing things correctly, so there isn't a phonological issue there. If you look at soon, goat, and boy, you have very surface level phonetic understanding. You have soon and goat with some spellings that they probably have learned. But boy is a diphthong that's moving through, and so they're hearing the initial and the end sound. They don't have an understanding of what a diphthong is and how a diphthong moves, what it sounds like as it articulated so quickly together, so they need to go back and be taught that. So a lot of these kids are doing pretty well phonetically, but they're having some difficulties on some fine-tunings, as you can see. Like, we need to go and fine-tune some of this articulation that we're hearing. We need to fine-tune some of what they're hearing. Trey, Troubles, and Dragon has an affrication, so to go back and work on that movement between the sound, the two sound letters. Same thing with the flaps coming up. And down here on the last one, where they're confusing their glides, the watch, the will, and the church. So they're hearing too much of that and not articulating or understanding the fullness of that sound. And so we'd go back and correct that for that H for church, and then that confusion between the Y and the W sound. So you can get a lot of information phonologically about their development or where they are and places that you need to go intervene just by looking at how they're spelling things. It's one of my favorite things to do is to analyze their spelling, because we get such a good indication of what their processing is and how much they understand. So a lot of these guys up here have good phoneme awareness, but poor understanding of the letter sound connection. So there's more of we call it a graphotactic or a grapheme error up at the top there. Okay, so let's take a look at some more. We have milk, and they wrote M-I-K-E. So there's an omission of consonants within blends or clusters. So we're missing that consonant blend sound. So again, some segmenting work is needed. You have items with a N instead of a T. So there's some confusion of that similar articulation. T and N are right in the same column. And so they're having a bit of articulation of where to send the sound as a voice, a stop to a nasal. So you'd have to go back and reteach the difference between that, even though they're articulated in the same place. Cinnamon is an omission of a syllable. So they need to go back and do some work with syllables and hearing that beat, being able to pull out the syllable pieces. Frightening, of course, is again, this one is a little bit phonological because they're not hearing it. They've omitted the EN ending, and the ED, they've got some confusion there. So you're going to have to do some more phonological work of, are they hearing the ending correctly? But then you need to reteach them what that morphological ending is, what the inflected ending is. So that's what we call a morphological error as well, because they are messing up on what the ending is. Does that make sense? Then we have confusion on color in bed. We have a confusion and misordering of some nasals. So they're hearing the nasal, but they're not hearing it distinct enough. So we're going to have some phonological work with really focusing in on those nasals. And then, of course, some vowel substitutions. They're far from the target, so they don't have a clear understanding what those vowel sounds are, how to make them. So they're pulling what something's like, somewhere in there. It's just pulling out of your hat, right? So right here, they're not fully aware of phoneme identity or sequence. You can see a lot of it, like they're not quite fully aware of the identity of that sound, the sequence of that syllable. They're not fully aware of these sounds and those vowel sounds. So they're struggling phonologically. Let me go back, sorry. They're struggling phonologically, and they're going to need to go back and do some more isolated work with sounds, and then do some blending or co-articulation work so that they don't lose those sounds when they put them together. All right, well, that will conclude chapter 3. I hope that you gained a lot of insight. Please let me know if you have any questions or anything that you would like to be clarified, and have a great rest of the day.